Now that we have the basic understanding of how Houdini works in general, now let's dive deep inside of Houdini. And so first, let's talk about groups, how we can create groups, how we can manage groups. And as you can know that groups are very useful for managing the geometry. First, let's create a geometry node in here. I'm going to create a geometry node because we know that we need the SOP network if we are going to work with geometry. So let's create a geometry node and let's dive inside. And right now it's empty. And in here, I'm going to create a rubber toy geometry. So if you type rubber toy, and that is the default geometry that comes with Houdini. So you can create this. So let's add the rubber toy geometry in here. And here we have a very lovely looking rubber toy. We can create the groups by activating our selection tool. So let me activate my selection tool. I can select and drag. Now I am selecting the primitives. So these polygons are actually called the primitive inside of Houdini. And I can change this to edges by clicking on this edge. Now I am able to select all of the edges, and I can change this to point mode by activating the point selection. Now by selecting them, and I can select the points. And if you want to change the selection, because right now here as you can see I am dragging the marquee selection, I can change this by, if we come over here as you can see we have the currently box select enabled. I can change this to lasso select. So let's click on it. Now I can draw the lasso, and that way I can start selecting my geometry. Or I can just change this to brush selection, and that way we have this brush. And right now it is very hard to see, but it's actually, there is a circle at this pointer location. I can change the circle by changing this radius. So just hover over to that parameter, press and hold the middle mouse button. I can just drag, click and drag. And here as you can see, now I have this bigger brush. And I can also change this to laser select. So laser select is basically just a selecting for these single points. Okay, it's what we call this one a point selector maybe. So let me activate my box selection, and here we have the option. So it says select visible geometry. So if this option is enabled, that way I can only select the geometry that is actually visible to this camera angle. So if I drag this selection box and rotate my camera, and here as you can see all of the points that are outside of our camera, they are not being selected. So if I disable this option, let me uncheck this select visibility, and now if I draw my marquee selection, now I should have selected all of the geometry, and here as you can see all of my geometry has been selected. I can drag and all of my geometry has been selected. If I enable this camera selection constraint and draw again, and now here as you can see the parts of the geometry that was not visible are not being selected. When we have selected all of the points or the primitive, I can bring up the node menu by pressing the tab key on my keyboard, and in here I can just simply type the group and press enter, and that will create the group node and assign the selection that currently been active in the viewport into this group. So let me activate my view tool, and if I enable the parameter of the group tool, here as you can see the group type has been automatically set to points because we have selected the points. And here into the base group we have all of the list of number of points, these array of points that we had in the selection. So now all of the points are in the group 1. I can rename this group into the group name. I can type this any name that I want. Maybe let's type this my underscore group. And now I can check if you press and hold the middle mouse button. And here as you can see we have this down here 1 point group, and the group name is the my group. Let's see the different ways of how we can create the groups. So first I'm going to just remove this group node, and in here I can type the group node, and let's add this and connect this into our this geometry, view the node, and let's bring up the parameter of the group. And at the very top we can define the group name, as you can know. Okay, so right now it's set to group 1, that is the name. And onto the group type, here we can define which of these types we are going to storing. So if it's a primitive group, which means these faces, we can change this to points group, and here you can see now we are storing all of the points inside of this group. Or we can make this group an edges group, so now we have all of the edges. Or we can make this an vertices group. In other 3D software, points and vertices are the same, so they are called same. But in Houdini, points and vertices are not the same, so vertices are different than points. Please do keep in mind. We can change the group type in here. Let me keep this to the primitive group. Okay, so that we have the primitives. Into the base group, we can define which primitive we want in the base group. So right now it's enabled, and when this value is empty, which means all of the primitives are inside of this group, I can manually specify them if I enable this option by clicking on this arrow. And here as you can see, that will switch me into the viewport, this selection, which means I can draw the selection and I can press enter to complete my selection. And here as you can see, the base group option has been filled with all of these arrays of numbers. So these are actually the primitive numbers. So I can just select all of them and delete them. So now all of the primitives are inside of this group. And we can actually visualize our primitive number if you come over here. So these are our viewport visualizer. So at first we have this one that is for the display point. If you enable this, that will enable our this point display. I can uncheck this to disable the point visualization. And in here we have this display primitive number visualizer. So if you click on it, that will show you the current primitive number. And if I zoom in, and here as you can see, we have an A primitive and its number is 5983. So if I want that primitive in my group, I can just simply type the name onto the base group. So if I want to add this primitive into my group, I'm going to just type the number 5983. And here as you can see, only that primitives are now inside of this group. And I can keep adding the primitives. So I can just hit space, and now I can pick another primitive, let's say 6361. So I'm going to type 6361 in here. And here as you can see, now we have these two primitive inside of that group. So that's the very basic way of how this group node work and how you can group the geometry. Let me uncheck this primitive display visualization by clicking on this display primitive number. That will hide the visualization. And in here, I'm going to just uncheck this base group. Okay, so now that base group has been unchecked, now we have the group 1, but now this group is empty. So if I middle mouse button, and here as you can see, we have an A1 primitive group, and it is called the group 1. And right now we do not have any primitives in here, so it says 0. So I can enable this another option that is called the keep in the bounding region. I can enable this. And first we have this bounding type. Right now the bounding type is set to bounding box, which means that at the center here as you can see, we have this bounding box. All of the primitives that are inside of this box will going to be in that group. I can adjust the size. If I middle mouse button, I can adjust the size X. I can adjust the Y size, and onto the center I can adjust the position of my box. So wherever this bounding box is, all of the points will going to be grouped inside of that box. I can change this bounding type geometry. I can change this to bounding sphere. And here as you can see, we have this spherical piece of geometry, bounding geometry. Okay, so wherever this sphere is, we will have these primitive in the groups. And onto the bounding type, we also have the option for the bounding objects. So it means that if you click on this bounding object, and this node will throw an error, because we are saying that we are going to assign our own bounding geometry, and we are going to assign this bounding geometry into this second input. And if you hover over to this second input, here as you can see, we have this bounding object. So right now it is empty. That is why it is throwing an error. So which means I can create any geometry that I like. Let's say create a sphere in here. So let's create this sphere. Okay, here we have the sphere, and I can just connect this in here and I can view. And here as you can see, the error is still there. So let me enable the parameter of the group node. And if you, here as you can see, it says that bounding objects only supports the points and vertices group. So which means we cannot create a primitive group if we are going to use this second input, this bounding geometry. So which means we must need to set this into primitive, into the points or vertices. So let me change this to points, and here as you can see, the error is gone. And now all of the points that are inside of my this sphere geometry are now being grouped. And I can create a transform node in between to adjust the location of my sphere. So let's add a transform and connect this. And onto the transform, let's bring up the parameter. Let's adjust the translation, X translation and Y translation. And here as you can see, wherever my sphere is, all of the points are being in the group. But now let's say the group node is only support the points, but I want the primitives. I don't want the points. So I can actually promote this group into the edges or primitive. We can promote this by creating a group promote node. So let's add a group promote and let's connect this in here. And onto the group promote, first we need to define the group name, which group that we want to promote. So onto this one, I'm going to select the group 1 because that is the name of our group 1. And right now we are converting this from auto to points. Auto means that it will know its current group type, and we are going to convert this into points, but we want to convert this into primitives. So let's select this. And now here as you can see, all of our groups has been converted into primitive. I can also convert them into edges. So now we have the edges group. So you can promote or convert any group types into any types. Okay, so if you have the primitive group and you want to convert them into points, you can do so by adding the group promote node. Let me change this back to primitive. And now I can just play around with this sphere, and here as you can see, I can interactively create the groups onto this region. So let me remove this group promote node and let's remove all of these from the second input, and let's uncheck this keep in bounding region. And we have the other option that is called the keep by normals. So if I enable this, and here we can define the direction of the normals. So first let me disable the keep by normal, and we can view the normals of our geometry if we enable this option. Here you can see that is called the display normals. If I enable this, and here as you can see, we have these blue lines. So these are the geometry normals. Okay, so all of the geometries has normals. So the normals have these direction that is storing the primitive facing directions. And here as you can see, all of these faces have their own direction, which means we can group these primitives in the specific facing in the specific directions. So let me uncheck this display normals option to hide the visualizer, and let's enable the keep by normals, and let's enable this. And onto the direction, we can define the direction. And right now we have this option X, that is the X direction, that is the Y direction, and that is the Z direction. And here we have the spreading angle. Let's adjust this spreading angle. And here as you can see, all of the points that are now completely at the 60-degree spread facing onto the Z axis. The last axis is the Z axis. All of these are now in this group. I can change this into primitive group. And here as you can see, we have all of these primitive groups. I can actually reverse the direction by coming over onto the direction, and let's change this from 1 to -1. And here as you can see, now all of these primitives that are facing onto the opposite sides of the z-axis are now in that group. Okay, so the range is between in 0 and 1. Let's change this to 0 onto the z-axis, and maybe let's enable the x-axis. I'm going to change this to 1. So all of the faces that are now facing onto this x-axis are now in our group. And same way I can change the direction in minus by adding the -1 in here. And same way, let's zero it out and let's change this to 1 onto the y. And here as you can see, all of the faces that are pointing upward are now in this group, and we can adjust this spreading angle. So that's the keep by normal. Let me uncheck this, and we also have the option to include by edges. Let's enable this, and in here we can define the minimum edge angle. So if I enable this, and here as you can see, we can define the edge angle. All of the edges that are in that angle will be in the group. Or I can enable this by maximum edge length, and right now here as you can see, I cannot enable this option because right now we are in the primitive group and we need to in the edges group. Let's enable this, and now here as you can see, we can enable this option. So let's enable the minimum edge length and let's disable this edge angle option, and in here I can define the edge length. So if we take a look, here as you can see, we have this one point and here we have the another point. So I can measure the length. If I know the length and I want all of these edges that have the same length in the group, I can just define that. I'm going to just randomly pick a length, and let me zoom out, and let's maybe select a very low this increment, and let's keep increasing that. And here as you can see, all of these edges that have the 0.043 length will be in that group, and all of the smaller edges we are discarding all of these smaller edges. You can group this by this edge length. Here we have the minimum edge length. I can enable this by maximum edge length, and at the very last we have this keep by random chance. I can enable this, and by enabling this I can randomly create the groups. So onto the percentages, the 100 mean that all of the geometry in the group, and the value of 50% of all of the edges being placed in that group randomly. And we can adjust this random seed by adjusting this global seed. So every time you adjust this global seed, that will randomize this selection. I can change this to primitives, and I can keep playing around with that. And here as you can see, I am grouping the 50% of these random primitives. And we also have a node called group by range, which is very useful. So let's create a group by range node in here. Let me add this, and for this I'm going to create a tube geometry, polygonal tube, and let's connect this in here. Let me view this. Let's view the result of this group by range. And onto the group by range, here I can define the start and end position. So the start and end mean if I enable the primitive number, because right now we are working with primitive groups, so that is why I'm enabling the primitive number. And here as you can see, we have the 0, 1, 2, 3, all of these primitive number. Let's say I want to skip this 0, so I can say start with 1. Enable start with 1, and here as you can see, we are skipping this first primitive. I can say start with 2, and now we are skipping these first two primitives. And in here I can also say that I can start this 0 and end my selection at the primitive number 8. So I can go into the end and type the 8. The first 8 primitives must be selected. So let me see. End mean because it's actually says relative to start and end. Okay, so I can change this to start and end. Okay, so let's change this, and now I can select the first 8 primitive, and here as you can see, by selecting the 8 we are selecting first 8 primitives. So the range type was the relative, and that is why it was actually not working, because it was selecting the relative length. And let me change this to 0 and 1. Okay, so which means all of the geometries are in the group. And onto the range filter, I can select every one of one. Right now it said select every one of one. I can change this to one of two. So one of two mean we are skipping every second primitive, and I can change this to third 3. So now we should skip the every third. So there we have these two primitives gap in here. And if I create a grid node in here, maybe let's add a grid node and connect this into the range. And here as you can see, let me hide the primitive number display, and I can now select every one of two. And here as you can see, I am selecting the checker pattern, and I can keep changing this to 1/5 or 6. So you can define your own range to create a pattern of groups. So maybe I can, after the group, I can create a extrusion in here. So I'm going to add a poly extrude node. So let's add this and connect this at the end. And onto the poly extrude, here we have the option for the group. So let's select this group 1. And right now the extrusion is not happening because we need to adjust the distance. So let's add some positive distance value, and here as you can see, we have these extrusions. So now I can go into the group by range. I can play around with these groups, and here as you can see, all of this poly extrude will work procedurally, because that is a procedural setup. I can create a random group. So maybe let's create a group node in here and connect this, and I'm going to disable the base group and keep by random chance, play around with this random value and connect this. Because the group name has been changed, right now it says group 2, so we need to update this poly extrude from group 1 to group 2. And here as you can see, we have these extrusion, and I can play around with this percentages. I can play around with this seed value. These are the different ways that you can create the groups inside of Houdini.